Fire her now. Victor Crane slammed his hand on the table. She approved the report. She owns this failure. 30 executives turned to look at Emily Carter, 24 years old, junior assistant, the woman who made their coffee. Nobody saw her glance at the system display. Nobody saw her go still, the particular stillness of someone who has just spotted something catastrophic, hiding inside 1,100 lines of data. They were already voting to destroy her career. They had 18 minutes before they destroyed the company. Subscribe to our channel. Follow Emily's story to the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most critical mornings do not, with a warning. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of small wrong choices stacking quietly on top of each other, until the whole structure became too heavy to hold. Emily Carter arrived at Westbridge Technologies at 6:47 in the morning. She always arrived before anyone else, not because anyone asked her to, not because her job description required it. She arrived early because she had learned through 3 years of watching this company operate that the first hour of a working day was when the real information lived, before people rehearsed their conversations, before they decided what to hide, before they remembered to perform. In that first hour you could hear the truth. She had set her laptop on her small desk at the far end of the operations floor, 2 full levels below where the executives would eventually gather. She had checked the overnight system reports. She had cross-referenced 3 separate data logs. And at 7:14, she had seen something that made the coffee she was holding go cold in her hand. A flag. Buried inside 1,100 lines of automated system data, a single flag had appeared that should not have been there. Not on a Tuesday. Not 48 hours before the biggest product launch in Westbridge history. Not after the executive team had already issued a company-wide announcement promising shareholders a flawless rollout. Emily had stared at that flag for 4 minutes. Then she had opened a new email. She had addressed it to Marcus Holt, the director of engineering, the man whose department owned the system, the man who had been with Westbridge for 19 years and who had approximately 0 interest in receiving morning corrections from a junior operations assistant. She had written 6 sentences. She had explained what she found. She had described the flag in plain language. She had attached the relevant section of the log. She had asked him to confirm whether the testing team was aware. Then she had pressed send, and she had waited. By 8:15 he had not responded. By 9:30 the entire building was already in motion. Department heads moving toward the elevator banks, assistants carrying armfuls of printed reports, the low electrical hum of institutional machinery, convincing itself that everything was under control. At 9:48, Emily sent the email a second time. At 10:20, Marcus Holt walked past her desk on his way to the 11th floor meeting and did not look at her once. She existed in the category of people that powerful men had trained themselves not to see. The same category as the building's cleaning crew, the security guard at the lobby desk, the young woman who refilled the paper in the executive printer. Necessary, invisible, not worth the adjustment of eye contact. Emily watched him disappear into the elevator. She went back to the data. The flag had not disappeared. If anything, what she was reading now suggested it had grown. The conference room on the 38th floor was designed to project power. The table could seat 40 people. The chairs were leather, real leather, the kind that cost more than a month of Emily's salary per unit. 3 walls displayed live data on screens that refreshed every 60 seconds. The 4th wall was glass floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city below, and on a morning like this, with cloud cover low and the light pressing flat against the skyline, it had the effect of making everyone inside feel suspended above the world, rather than simply part of it. This was where decisions were made. This was where careers were built and ruined in the same sentence. Emily had been inside this room exactly twice before. Once to deliver a package. Once to fill water glasses before a board dinner. Both times she had entered from a side door, done what she needed to do, and left before anyone had reason to notice her. Today, she was sitting at the table. not by invitation, by accident, or rather by the particular ruthlessness of institutional panic. At 11:15, the system failure had registered across 3 simultaneous dashboards. At 11:17, Marcus Holt had called an emergency executive session. At 11:22, someone in the operations department had pointed out that Emily Carter had signed off on a section of the morning report. The word "signed off" was not accurate. Emily had prepared the report. She had forwarded it. She had flagged the anomaly inside it. But in the frantic architecture of blame that assembles itself whenever something goes catastrophically wrong, the distinction between prepared and flagged and approved and authorized collapsed completely. Someone said her name. Someone else said she should be present. And so Emily Carter found herself sitting at the far corner of a table, surrounded by 30 executives, none of whom had ever spoken to her directly, all of whom were now watching her with the particular cold focus of people who have already decided what you are and are simply waiting for you to confirm it. Daniel Whitmore stood at the head of the table. He was 51 years old. He had built Westbridge from 11 employees to 11,000. He had a reputation for decisiveness that his admirers called strength and his detractors called something uglier. He was not a cruel man by design. He was a man who had learned that speed protected him and that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing a leader could display. He looked at Emily the way a person looks at an unfamiliar object that has appeared where a familiar object used to be, confused, not angry yet, but getting there. "Who are you?" he said. It was not a kind question. It was not meant to be. "Emily Carter," she said. "Junior Operations Assistant, sir, 3rd floor. And why are you in this room?" "I was told to come up," she said. "Your assistant called my extension at 11:24. Daniel turned briefly to the woman beside him, who confirmed this with a small nod. He turned back to Emily. "You signed off on the morning system report," he said. "I prepared it," Emily said carefully. "I flagged a data anomaly in Section 12 and emailed Marcus Holt at 7:14 this morning." The room shifted. 30 people recalibrated. Marcus Holt, sitting 6 seats to Daniel's left, did not move his face by a single millimeter. "I received no such email," Marcus said. The room accepted this immediately. Emily felt the weight of it, that specific gravity of a room full of important people deciding that someone without power has said something untrue. It was a physical sensation. She had felt it before. Not here. Other rooms. Other versions of this same dynamic. "I can show you the sent confirmation," she said quietly. "That's not what matters right now," Daniel said. "What matters is that in 12 hours, we are supposed to be launching a platform update to 4 million users. And as of 11:15 this morning, our primary system is showing failure across 3 diagnostic channels. So what I need to understand, what everyone in this room needs to understand, is how that happened." The silence lasted 6 seconds. Then Victor Crane, the chief operating officer, leaned forward in his chair. Victor Crane was the kind of executive who had mastered the specific art of turning a meeting's energy against the weakest person in the room. He had done it dozens of times. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy, the instinct to find the pressure release valve before the whole system exploded. He looked at Emily. "You prepared the report," he said. "Yes. You're the last person in the operations chain who touched the system data before this failure." "I touched the report," Emily said. "Not the system itself. I don't have access to the system core. My clearance level is—" "I'm not asking about your clearance level," Victor said. "I'm asking whether you understand the damage you may have contributed to." The word "contributed" landed like a verdict. Emily felt every eye in the room move to her face, looking for the crack, looking for the flinch, for the tears or the stammering or the desperate apology that would confirm what they already believed, that she was small, that she was a mistake, that she was easily removed and the problem would dissolve with her. She did not flinch. She folded her hands on the table in front of her and said, "With respect, Mr. Crane, I believe the failure is not related to the operations report at all." Chautut. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the silence before it. The first silence had been the silence of people waiting for her to confirm her guilt. This one was the silence of people who had not expected her to say that. Victor Crane's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "Excuse me. I reviewed the system logs this morning before 7 o'clock, Emily said. The flag I found in Section 12 is consistent with a conflict between two sequential software updates that were applied to the platform in the last 72 hours. Update A and Update B interact incorrectly when the platform operates above a specific traffic threshold. In our simulated environment, we never reached that threshold. In a live deployment to 4 million users." "Stop," Marcus Holt said. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "You're an operations assistant," he said. "You prepare reports and file documentation. You are not qualified to analyze system architecture failures." "I'm not analyzing the architecture," Emily said. "I'm describing what I found in the data." "Data you clearly misread." "The email I sent you at 7:14. I already told you," Marcus said, and his voice dropped to a register that was not quite a threat, but was the precursor to one. "I received no such email." Emily reached into the folder she had carried upstairs with her. She placed a single printed sheet on the table, the delivery confirmation from her email server. Time-stamped, with Marcus Holt's address clearly visible in the recipient field. The silence that followed was a different kind again. Victor Crane looked at the sheet, then at Marcus, then at the sheet again. Daniel Whitmore said nothing. Marcus Holt looked at the paper for a long time. "My inbox receives several hundred communications daily," he said. "It's possible It's possible," Daniel said quietly, in the voice he used when he had just recalculated something fundamental. Emily did not press the point. She had not brought the confirmation sheet to humiliate Marcus Holt. She had brought it because a billion-dollar launch was disintegrating in real time, and the only way to stop it was to establish first that she had not manufactured this crisis, and second, that she might have seen it coming before anyone else. 14 minutes, said a voice from the far end of the table. Everyone looked. One of the technical directors was watching the countdown clock embedded in the system display on the east wall. The clock that showed the time remaining before the platform's automatic global deployment would initiate. 14 minutes, 31 seconds. The number was not metaphorical. It was not atmospheric. It was the precise amount of time remaining before Westbridge's failed system pushed a broken update to 4 million users, crashed 2 days before a shareholder earnings call, and became the kind of incident that finance journalists wrote retrospective articles about using the word preventable. Victor Crane stood up. "Get the full engineering team on this immediately. I want every department head on the phone and—" "That won't work," Emily said. Victor turned to look at her. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he was not expecting and has not yet decided whether it constitutes a threat. "Excuse me. The engineering team has already tried 3 corrective patches in the last 40 minutes, Emily said. "I can see the attempt history in the system log right here." She turned her laptop to face the table. Each patch attempted the same approach. They tried to override the conflict at the deployment layer. But the conflict isn't in the deployment layer. It's in the synchronization protocol between the 2 updates. Overriding at the deployment level doesn't fix the underlying incompatibility. It just delays it by approximately 4 to 7 minutes, and then the failure reoccurs. The technical director at the far end of the table leaned forward slowly. His name was Graham Pierce. He had been with Westbridge for 11 years. He was the kind of engineer who spoke rarely in executive meetings and thought in long, slow, precise lines. He looked at Emily's screen. "Show me the synchronization log," he said. Emily pulled up the file. Graham Pierce read for approximately 30 seconds. Then he looked up. "She's right," he said. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Victor Crane turned to look at Graham, the way executives always turn to look at the people who said the thing they needed to be true but were afraid to believe. "You're certain? The conflict is in the handshake protocol between updates 7.4 and 7.5 alpha, Graham said. If the team has been patching at the deployment layer, they've been patching the wrong address. Every fix they applied would have failed within minutes of live deployment. Daniel Whitmore was very still. He had the particular stillness of a man who runs a company and has just learned that his company had been running toward a cliff for the last 4 hours, and the only person who had seen the cliff was a 24-year-old assistant sitting at the corner of his conference table. He looked at Emily. "Can it be fixed? 12 minutes," said the voice from the far end of the table. Emily looked at the clock, then at Daniel. "Yes," she said. "How long do you need?" 11 minutes. The room processed this arithmetic. 11 minutes to perform a fix. 1 minute of margin. "What do you need?" Daniel asked. "Direct write access to the synchronization layer," she said. "And I need everyone else to stop applying patches. Every additional patch attempt is going to compress my window." Victor Crane said, "We can't give write access to the synchronization layer to someone who isn't..." "Victor," Daniel said. "One word." Victor Crane sat down. Daniel looked at Graham Pierce. "Can she do this?" Graham looked at Emily with the careful, evaluating eyes of a man who understood exactly what was being asked. "If she's reading this log correctly, and she is, then yes," Graham said. "The correction pathway she's describing is technically sound. I've never seen someone outside the core team identify a handshake protocol conflict from system log data alone. I've been reading the system logs every morning for 8 months, Emily said. "Why?" Daniel asked. "Because nobody else was," she said simply. The room had no answer for that. Daniel looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he said, "Give her the access." Gauze. The next 11 minutes were the longest of Emily Carter's life. Not because the technical challenge was beyond her. It was not. She had rehearsed variations of this problem in her head on the commute home on weekends, in the margins of her own time, that she had spent studying a system that technically did not belong to her. What made those 11 minutes extraordinary was the silence. The specific, pressure-saturated silence of 30 powerful people standing behind a 24-year-old woman and having nothing to say. Victor Crane stood to her right 3 feet back, arms crossed. He did not offer help. He did not interfere. He simply watched with the focused attention of a man trying to determine whether his instincts had been catastrophically wrong. Marcus Holt had moved to the other side of the room. He was staring at the system display but not looking at any specific thing on it. He had the careful internal stillness of someone managing something difficult that had nothing to do with the technical problem in front of them. Graham Pierce positioned himself beside Emily's left shoulder. He was not there to take over. He was there the way an experienced pilot stands behind a first officer during a difficult approach, not to intervene, but to witness and to catch anything that might slip. Emily worked. Her hands were steady. She had good hands, her father had always said that. Hands that did not shake under pressure. Hands that moved with the particular economy of someone who had practiced something so many times that the motion had become automatic, the thinking able to happen somewhere above the level of the physical. At 9 minutes remaining, she found the handshake fault. It was exactly where she'd expected it to be. She said nothing out loud. She simply navigated to the correction pathway and began the sequence. At 7 minutes, Graham Pierce made a small sound, not a word. Just a sound that people who had worked with him for years would have recognized as something between approval and held breath. At 5 minutes, the system threw an unexpected error. The room heard it, the soft ping of a system alert, and the collective inhale was audible. Emily stopped. She read the error message. She looked at the synchronization log. She read the error message again. "What is that?" Victor Crane said, and despite himself, his voice had lost its authority. He sounded the way everyone in the room actually felt frightened, not of Emily, but of the clock. "It's a secondary conflict," Emily said. "Same class of problem, different location. Update 7.3 has a partial overlap with what I just corrected. It's trying to reapply a protocol that the correction just removed." "Can you route around it?" Graham said. "I need to disable the 7.3 legacy pathway before I can complete the correction," she said. If I disable it without checking the dependency chain, I might break something else. 4 minutes, said the voice from the far end of the table. How long to check the dependency chain? Graham asked. Normally 20 minutes. And right now. Emily was already reading. Her eyes moved across 300 lines of dependency data faster than should have been possible for someone doing it manually. But Emily Carter did not read code the way most people read code. She had learned to read it the way her father read it, not line by line, but as a pattern, as a kind of visual music, where wrong notes created dissonance that the eye could catch before the brain had fully articulated why. She found the relevant dependencies in 2 minutes 40 seconds. There were 4 of them. 3 were clean. 1 was not. I need to modify 1 additional parameter, she said. 30 seconds, maybe less. 2 minutes on the clock, the voice said. Emily did not respond. She was already working. The room had stopped breathing. Not metaphorically. The people in that room, some of whom had spent decades in high-pressure business environments, had collectively stopped performing the basic involuntary function of pulling air into their lungs. Daniel Whitmore, standing 6 feet behind Emily's right shoulder, was very still. He was thinking in the odd dissociated way that crisis produces about the morning she had arrived. The day he had passed her in the lobby 3 years ago when she was new and the company was different and he had not seen her, not as a person with a name or a mind or a history. He was thinking about the email she had sent at 7:14. He was thinking about Marcus Holt, who had not opened it. He was thinking about the word contributed. The word Victor had chosen the word that had been designed to assign blame and end a conversation and protect the people in the room who needed protecting. And he was thinking that he had sat at that table 2 feet from that word and had not challenged it. 30 seconds, the voice said. Emily made 3 keystrokes. She checked the output against the dependency she had found. She made 1 more keystroke. The system display changed. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. The numbers on the diagnostic dashboard shifted from red to yellow cautionary, not critical, and then over the course of 4 seconds that seemed to last longer than the previous 20 minutes combined, from yellow to a steady, consistent green. The automatic deployment countdown stopped. It did not reach 0. It stopped. The system had been stabilized. The launch had been pulled back. The failure had been resolved. The room was completely silent. Emily leaned back slightly in the chair. She let out a single, slow breath. Graham Pierce put 1 hand on the back of the chair for just a moment, not touching her, not claiming the moment, simply acknowledging it, the way someone who understands what they have just witnessed will sometimes need to mark the occasion physically. Then he straightened and looked at Daniel Whitmore, and Daniel Whitmore looked at Emily Carter. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, carrying a folder full of documentation that nobody had asked her to bring. The expression on his face was not assessment or skepticism or the calculating patience of a man deciding how to manage a liability. It was something else entirely. Something older than corporate strategy and longer than a quarterly earnings cycle. Emily looked at the green display. She looked at the clock, which now showed a negative number. The countdown had stopped with 41 seconds remaining. 41 seconds. That was the margin. That was how close a billion-dollar company, 4 million users and 30 executives who had wanted her fired had come to the edge. 41 seconds separated the outcome they got from the outcome they had been hurtling toward all morning. Daniel Whitmore said her name. Emily. She turned. What made you come up here? He asked. When you got the call to come to this room when you knew what this meeting was, what made you bring the documentation? Emily looked at him for a moment. I didn't bring it to protect myself, she said. I brought it because the problem was in there. She nodded toward the folder. And if nobody looked at it, the problem wouldn't go away just because I did. The room absorbed this. The people who had come into that conference session, expecting to fire a junior assistant, began the slow, disorienting process of understanding who they had actually been dealing with. Victor Crane had not moved. He was looking at the green display, and then at Emily, and then at the space between those two things, working through something that his face had not yet decided how to express. Marcus Holt had moved to the window. He was looking at the skyline, his back to the room, and anyone who had watched him in a boardroom before would have recognized the specific set of his shoulders for what it was. Not anger, but the posture of a man who had understood privately, and without the option of misunderstanding, exactly what had happened today and exactly what his role in it had been. Graham Pierce picked up Emily's folder from the table and began reading through it with a focus that had nothing to do with the meeting and everything to do with the mind of a man who had just watched someone do something he had not previously believed an operations assistant could do. And Daniel Whitmore pulled out the chair beside Emily and sat down. Not at the head of the table, beside her. "Tell me," he said quietly. "From the beginning. Tell me everything you found." And so, Emily Carter, 24 years old, junior operations assistant. The woman who had poured their coffee and printed their documents and been described by a senior executive as someone who should be fired before lunch began to talk. And the most powerful people in the building listened. Every word. Daniel Whitmore was not a man who asked questions he didn't already know the shape of. He had built an 11,000-person company by understanding faster than most people in a room which questions would cut to the center of a problem and which ones were theater. He asked the theater questions in public, the ones that demonstrated authority, that showed the room he was in control. He saved the real questions for private. This was a real question. "From the beginning," he said again. "Tell me everything." Emily looked at the folder in front of her. Then she looked at Graham Pierce, who had set the folder back on the table and was watching her with the quiet attention of someone who had already decided she was worth listening to. Then she looked at Daniel, who had pulled his chair close enough that this was no longer a presentation. This was a conversation. She began. "8 months ago," she said, "I noticed that the customer complaint logs were running at roughly 3 times the industry average for a platform of our size. Not catastrophic. Not enough to trigger an escalation. But consistent. Every 2 to 3 weeks, a cluster of complaints about system lag, session timeouts, and data synchronization errors. Always small. Always in the same general window of time." "Why were you reading customer complaint logs?" Daniel asked. "Because I processed the weekly summary reports," she said. "It's part of my job. But the summary strips the pattern. It gives you a number. It says 212 complaints this week, up 3% from last week. It doesn't tell you that 200 of those 212 complaints happened in a 4-hour window on a Thursday afternoon. I started reading the raw logs because the summary wasn't telling the whole story." Graham Pierce made a low sound. Not agreement exactly. More like the sound a person makes when they hear something said plainly that they have been circling around for years without landing on it. "The raw logs," Daniel repeated. "Yes, sir. Those logs are several thousand lines of data every week." "I know. You read them. Every week, for 8 months. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, not skeptically. He had moved past skepticism. He was now in the territory of a man trying to understand something about his own company that he had not understood before, using the most direct source of information available to him. "What did you find?" he said. "A pattern," Emily said. The complaints clustered around update events. Every time the development team pushed a system update, there was a lag window of 2 to 6 hours afterward where the complaint volume spiked. Most companies have some complaint volume after updates. That's normal. But ours was higher than it should have been, and it was consistent, which meant it wasn't random noise. It meant something structural was happening. She opened the folder. She had printed the relevant sections and organized them chronologically, not because she had been preparing for a meeting like this one, but because that was how she thought. Organized, sequential, built for reference, not performance. She placed the first sheet on the table in front of Daniel. "This is from 6 months ago," she said. Update cycle 7.1. The complaint spike ran for 3 hours after deployment. "Here," she pointed. "And here. Both times the errors were in session synchronization." She placed a second sheet. Update 7.2. 5 weeks later. Same pattern. The spike window extended to 4 hours this time. The synchronization errors increased by about 20%. A third sheet. 7.3. 4 weeks after that. The spike window reached 6 hours. The errors were now appearing in a different part of the system, not just session synchronization, but data handshake protocols. She paused. That was when I knew it wasn't the individual updates. It was the cumulative interaction between them. Each update was leaving a residue. A small incompatibility that didn't cause a visible failure on its own, but that stacked with each successive update and made the system incrementally more fragile. The room had gotten very quiet. Not the earlier silence, the boardroom silence of people managing their expressions and calculating their positions. This was a different quiet. The quiet of comprehension. Victor Crane had turned away from the window. He was looking at the sheets of paper on the table, with an expression that had, over the last several minutes, undergone a significant and visible change. "You identified this 6 months ago," he said. "I identified the pattern 6 months ago," Emily said. "I didn't fully understand the mechanism until about 10 weeks ago." "And you communicated this?" It was not quite a question. Emily opened the folder to a tabbed section near the back. She removed a stack of printed emails and placed them on the table. 14 emails, she said. To Marcus Holt's department. 4 to the general engineering inbox. 2 to the quality assurance team. And 1, 2 months ago, to your office. She looked at Victor. Your executive assistant confirmed receipt. The silence stretched. Victor Crane looked at the stack of emails. He was a man of 53 years who had learned to maintain a certain composure under pressure, not the real composure of someone who had made peace with difficulty, but the performed composure of someone who had rehearsed it until it became automatic. That performance was straining now. Emily could see it in the slight tension around his jaw, the way his hands had gone still at his sides. Our filtering system, he started. Victor, Daniel said. One word. Again, the same way he'd said it before. Quiet, final closing a door. Victor Crane stopped. Marcus Holt had turned from the window. He was facing the table now, and his expression was the expression of a man standing on ground that had shifted beneath him and who had not yet decided whether to acknowledge the shift or pretend the ground was still solid. He picked up one of the emails. His own name was in the recipient field. His own address. The date stamp read, 9 weeks ago. I want to be clear, Marcus said, that our department receives Marcus. Daniel did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, Emily had heard. He didn't need to. We're going to have a different conversation about the department's email processes, not right now. Marcus set the email back down. Emily watched him do it. She felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. She had not brought the emails to punish him. She had brought them because the question of why a system failure happened could not be answered honestly without them, and an honest answer was the only kind that would prevent it from happening again. The critical thing, Emily said, redirecting, because the meeting was drifting from the technical problem toward the political one, and she understood she had always understood which one actually mattered right now, is that the pattern I identified 6 months ago predicted exactly this. The update conflict I found in this morning's log is a direct extension of the cumulative incompatibility chain I've been tracking. It didn't appear overnight. It built. Slowly, predictably. And the reason it became critical today, specifically today, 48 hours before the biggest launch in the company's history, is that the deployment pressure accelerated the update schedule. Graham Pierce leaned forward. The last 3 updates in the 7-point cycle were compressed into 11 days, he said. Not to Emily, more to himself or to the room doing the arithmetic out loud. Instead of the standard 21-day interval. Yes, Emily said. The compressed schedule didn't give the system time to stabilize between updates. The cumulative incompatibility reached a threshold it wouldn't have reached for another 4 to 6 weeks under a normal cycle. The launch deadline moved the crisis forward. Daniel was quiet. He was doing the thing Emily had watched senior leaders do, when they received information that required them to recalibrate not just a tactical decision, but a strategic assumption. The stillness that came before a fundamental shift. The pause before the pivot. The compressed schedule, he said slowly. Who authorized that? Graham Pierce looked at his hands. Victor Crane looked at the middle distance. Daniel looked at both of them and understood from their silence everything he needed to know. We pushed the update schedule to meet the launch date, he said. It was not a question. The shareholders' announcement was made 6 weeks ago, Victor said. The launch date was fixed. The development team had to compress. We broke our own system to meet a deadline we announced before we confirmed the system could meet it, Daniel said. Victor opened his mouth, closed it. Yes, he said. The room absorbed this. Emily looked at the green indicators on the system display. The crisis was resolved. The system was stable. The launch could proceed now with the corrected protocols in place, or it could be delayed for a proper assessment. That decision belonged to the people in this room, to the executives and the shareholders and the complex machinery of corporate obligation. Her part, the technical part, was done. But Daniel was not done with her. The program your father developed, Daniel said. Emily stilled. She had not mentioned her father in this meeting. She had not mentioned him to anyone at Westbridge, not in her interview, not in 3 years of employment, not in 14 emails about system anomalies. She had been very deliberate about that. How do you know about that? She said. Graham, Daniel said. Graham Pierce had the expression of a man who had done something he had decided was justified and was now waiting to find out if he was right. While you were working the correction, Graham said, I recognized the approach. The dependency chain analysis you ran in under 3 minutes. I've only ever seen that done with that speed, using a methodology called cascade mapping. It was developed by a software engineer named Robert Carter about 12 years ago. It was never widely published. It was used in a small number of emergency system recovery applications. He paused. Robert Carter was your father. Emily said nothing for a moment. Yes, she said. He died 4 years ago. Yes. And you studied his work. I grew up with it, she said. He used to give me error logs to read when I was 15. He said the best way to understand a system was to understand how it failed. She paused. He believed that most system failures were predictable, that they always left a trail, that the trail was readable if you knew what to look for and if you were patient enough to look. The room was very still. That's what you've been doing? Daniel said. For 8 months, reading the trail. Someone had to, Emily said. And there it was. 3 words. No accusation in them. No anger. Just the simple, direct observation of someone who had done a thing because it needed doing, and because no one else was doing it. Someone had to. Daniel Whitmore looked at the table in front of him, at the printed emails, at the log extracts, at the methodical, painstaking documentation that a 24-year-old woman had assembled over 8 months, because she had noticed something nobody else had noticed, and had cared enough about it to track it even when every person she reported it to had failed to respond. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. All right, Emily said. After I sent you the email asking you to come to this meeting when you understood this was going to be an executive session about this morning's failure, what did you think was going to happen? Emily considered this. I thought you were going to fire me, she said. And you came anyway. Yes. With the documentation. Yes. Why? She had expected this question. She had known somewhere in the quiet of the elevator ride up that if she survived long enough for someone to ask it, this would be the question. Because the problem wasn't going to go away if I did, she said. The system would still fail. The launch would still go wrong. 4 million people would still get a broken update. And everyone in that meeting would spend the next 3 months looking for the source of the problem that I had already found. She paused. I didn't come here to save my job. I came here because if I had the information and I didn't use it, the outcome would be the same as if I had never found it at all. Daniel Whitmore was silent for long enough that Victor Crane shifted in his chair. Then Daniel said, What would you do differently if you were building this company from today? Victor Crane looked up sharply. The question was not the kind of question you asked a junior operations assistant. It was the kind of question you asked a strategic advisor, a partner, someone whose opinion you had already decided was worth more than their title suggested. Emily understood what Daniel was doing. She also understood that it was the kind of move that could generate significant resentment among the people in this room who had spent years earning the right to be asked that question and who were watching it be asked of someone who poured their coffee. She thought for a moment about how to answer carefully. Then she decided not to be careful. The information architecture, she said. You have a filtration problem, not just in the email system, in the whole structure of how information moves through this company. There's too many layers between the people who observe the system and the people who make decisions about it. By the time a complaint becomes a report, and a report becomes a summary, and a summary becomes a briefing, and a briefing becomes an agenda item, and an agenda item becomes a decision. 3 months have passed, and the pattern that was clear in the raw data is invisible in the processed version. She paused. My father used to say that the further you get from the original signal, the more noise you add and the more signal you lose. This company has too many translators and not enough people listening to the original. The room was very quiet. Graham Pierce had stopped pretending to look at the folder. He was watching Emily with the specific attention of someone who was recalibrating a significant assumption. Victor Crane's expression had shifted several times in the last 2 minutes. It had passed through defensiveness and arrived somewhere more complicated, something that was not quite humility, but was at least the outer edge of it, the place where a proud person's certainty begins to develop small cracks. The people who are closest to the original signal, Emily continued, are the people with the lowest titles, the people processing raw data, the people fielding customer calls, the people running overnight system checks. They see things that don't make it into the summaries. And most of them have learned because of how this company responds to information from people at their level to stop reporting what they see, because the cost of being ignored is lower than the cost of being dismissed. She paused again. I know that because I almost learned it too. After the 3rd email with no response, I almost stopped sending them. But you didn't, Daniel said. My father's voice, Emily said quietly. When I was about to stop, I'd hear him say the trail doesn't care who follows it. The failure is going to happen. The only question is whether someone was paying attention. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. Softer somehow, as if the room itself had shifted onto different ground. It was Victor Crane who broke it. And what he said was unexpected. How old were you when your father died? Emily looked at him. There was something genuine in the question, not strategic, not managing, something that Victor Crane rarely allowed into a professional setting, simple, direct human curiosity about another person. 20, she said. You were studying his work at 20. I'd been studying it since I was 15. After he died, I continued because... She stopped. Because it was the closest I could get to a conversation with him. Victor Crane looked at the table. Marcus Holt, standing at the periphery of the room, had not spoken in 12 minutes. He was listening. The particular quality of his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a man managing his position. It was the silence of a man thinking about something he would need to sit with for a while before he understood it completely. Graham Pierce said, The methodology you use to resolve the synchronization conflict, did you develop that yourself, or is it your father's? It's his framework, Emily said. I modified the dependency chain analysis for a cloud architecture. His work was built for server-based systems. The principles are the same, but the application needed to be adapted. You adapted a 12-year-old software recovery methodology to a modern cloud architecture on your own, Graham said. Over about 4 months? Emily said. Yes. Graham looked at Daniel. The look contained a large amount of information compressed into a second. Daniel looked at Emily. And you're an operations assistant, he said. It was not a criticism. It was not a question exactly. It was more like a man reading a sentence that should have said one thing and finding that it said something else entirely. Something that changed the meaning of everything around it. "I am," Emily said. "Third floor. I organize schedules and print documents and prepare coffee." "Not anymore," Daniel said. The air in the room shifted again. Victor Crane straightened slightly. Marcus Holt turned back toward the table. Graham Pierce pressed his lips together in the particular way of someone who has just heard a decision made that they agree with completely. "Sir," Emily said carefully, "if you're offering me a different position—" "I'm not offering you a position," Daniel said. "I'm telling you what you are, what you've been. The title is going to catch up to the reality, but the reality has been true for at least 8 months. He paused. "What I'm asking you, and this is a genuine question, not a formality, is what you want. What would you do with it?" Emily was quiet. She had thought about this, not in the specific career planning way of someone who had mapped their trajectory, in the quieter way of someone who had watched a problem exist for a long time and had begun in the privacy of their own thinking to imagine what a solution would look like. "The information problem," she said. "The filtration issue. I want to fix it, structurally, not just for this system, for the whole company. I want to build a pathway for people at every level to report what they actually see without it being filtered into uselessness before it reaches someone who can act on it." She paused. "And I want to review every update that's been applied to this platform in the last 18 months. Because if the 7-point cycle has a cumulative incompatibility issue, there may be earlier cycles with residual problems that haven't reached a failure threshold yet. We may be sitting on 3 or 4 more incidents that we don't know about." The silence that followed this was the silence of a room that has just been handed something it had not anticipated. Because Emily Carter, Jr., operations assistant, had just outlined in 4 sentences the 2 most critical strategic priorities that Westbridge Technologies faced in the next 6 months. And she had done it the way her father had always said you should approach a complex problem, not starting with the solution, but starting with the shape of the failure. Daniel Whitmore looked at her for a long time. Then he turned to Graham Pierce. "How long to run a full retrospective analysis on the update cycles from the last 18 months? "With the right team," Graham said. 4 weeks, maybe 3 if we're aggressive." "Do you have the right team?" Graham looked at Emily. "I do now," he said. Victor Crane exhaled. It was a long, controlled breath, the breath of a man setting something down that he had been carrying at the wrong angle for a long time. "There's going to need to be an internal review," he said, "of the communication failures, the email filtering system, the escalation protocols." "Yes," Daniel said, "that review is going to surface some uncomfortable findings." "Yes," Daniel said again. He looked at Victor steadily. "That's what reviews are for." Marcus Holt picked up the stack of Emily's emails from the table. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he set them back down. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was measured, not emotional. Marcus Holt was not a man who accessed his emotions easily in professional settings, but the words were direct, and directness from a man like Marcus Holt carried its own weight. "Not for the emails only, for this morning, in this room, the things I said." Emily looked at him. "I know you didn't read them," she said. "I think you need to understand that I also know it wasn't personal. You didn't ignore my emails because of me specifically. You ignored them because of what I was, junior low title, outside your chain of authority. Any one of 100 people in my position would have gotten the same response." She paused. "That's the problem, not you, the structure." Marcus Holt absorbed this. Emily had just done something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She had given Marcus Holt a way to understand what had happened without excusing him from it. She had reframed his failure not as character, but as system, which was both more accurate and, in a strange way, harder to bear. Because a character failure, you can separate from yourself. A systemic failure, one you participated in, one you helped create through thousands of small choices over years, that stays with you. Marcus Holt looked at her with an expression that was working through exactly this. Daniel Whitmore watched this exchange and said nothing. He was thinking about a conversation he had had with his own father 30 years ago when he was 22 and had just made his first significant business mistake and had expected to be dismantled by the criticism and instead been told something he hadn't fully understood until now. His father had said the measure of a company is not how it performs when everything works. It's how it behaves when it discovers what's broken. He looked around the conference room, at Victor Crane, who was wrestling with something private and necessary, at Marcus Holt, who was holding a stack of emails from a woman he had dismissed and working through what that said about him, at Graham Pierce, who had pulled out his own laptop and was already beginning to map the analysis framework Emily had described, at Emily Carter, 24 years old, who had walked into this room to be fired and had saved the company, and who was now sitting at his table, not with triumph, but with the steady, patient attention of someone who had never needed the room's validation to know what she was worth. The system display behind her was green. All green. Stable. Corrected. Holding. Daniel Whitmore thought that's exactly what she's been this whole time. Before anyone turned on the display. Before anyone looked. Stable. Holding. Already corrected and waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Graham Pierce worked fast. Within 40 minutes of the conference room clearing, he had assembled a technical subgroup, 6 engineers pulled from 3 different departments, and given them the framework Emily had outlined. He did not call it Emily's framework, not because he was taking credit for it, but because he understood from decades of working inside large organizations that the fastest way to get a team to reject a good idea was to tell them it came from someone they had previously decided didn't matter. He told them it was a retrospective analysis based on new diagnostic findings. He told them they were looking for cumulative incompatibility signatures in the update history going back 18 months. He told them they had 3 weeks. Then he walked back to the small conference room where Emily was sitting alone with her folder and her laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he sat down across from her. "The team is in motion," he said. "Which team?" Emily said. "6 engineers, cross-departmental, running the retrospective you described." Emily looked at him. "Did you tell them where the framework came from?" Graham was quiet for a moment. "I told them it was based on new diagnostic findings." She looked at him steadily. "I made a judgment call," Graham said. "The team needs to move fast. They won't move fast if they're processing the politics." "I understand," Emily said, and she did. It was not the choice she would have made, but she understood the reasoning, and she understood that Graham Pierce had made it for practical reasons rather than dishonest ones. "What happens when the analysis is complete?" "The findings will be attributed correctly," Graham said. "I'll make sure of that." "I'm not asking about attribution," Emily said. "I'm asking what happens to the people who are currently sitting on 3 or 4 potential system failures that nobody has flagged yet. Not the engineers, the people like me, the third-floor people who see things in raw data that don't make it into summaries." Graham looked at her. "That's the bigger problem," he said. "Yes," she said. "And it's not a technical problem." "No," she said. "It's a people problem, which is harder." Graham Pierce leaned back in his chair. He had spent 30 years solving technical problems, and had developed over those years a healthy respect for the category of problem that could not be solved with code. "Daniel wants to meet with you again at 4 o'clock, he said. "Victor Crane will be there, possibly the board liaison." Emily was quiet for a moment. "What's the board liaison's involvement?" "The launch failure, even a prevented one, is going to need to be reported to the board. The compressed update schedule was a board-level decision. Linking that schedule compression to the system instability is going to be a significant conversation." Emily absorbed this. She had understood in a theoretical way that what had happened this morning would have consequences beyond the conference room. But hearing it described as a board-level conversation made it concrete in a different way. The board meeting would produce minutes. The minutes would go on record. And the record would show that a system failure had been narrowly prevented because a junior operations assistant had spent 8 months reading raw data that no one in a position of authority had bothered to read. The implications of that ran in multiple directions. "Will I be in the 4 o'clock meeting?" she asked. "Daniel specifically asked for you," Graham said, "which is not something he does casually." Emily looked at her cold coffee. There are people in this company, she said, who are going to interpret all of this as an opportunity, to get ahead of something, to position themselves correctly relative to what happened today. That's going to create a version of the story that I won't necessarily recognize. Graham studied her. Is that what you're worried about? I'm worried about the next Emily, she said. The person on the third floor right now who is reading something in a data log and is composing an email to someone who won't open it. That person doesn't need a better story about today. They need a structural change that makes it impossible for the company to ignore them again. Graham Pierce looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said, in 30 years, I've sat across from a lot of people who survived something difficult and came out of it thinking primarily about what they were owed, what they'd earned, what restitution looked like. He paused. You're not doing that. I'm doing it a little, Emily said quietly. Internally. Graham almost smiled. Good. That's healthy. She almost smiled back. My father used to say the goal was never to be the smartest person in the room. The goal was to make the room smarter. She looked at the cold coffee. I don't think he fully anticipated how much resistance that involves. Graham was quiet. Then, what was he like? Emily looked up. It was not a question she had expected. Not here. Not in the middle of a day like this one. She considered deflecting, giving the professional version brilliant engineer exceptional mind under-recognized. The version you told people who didn't need the full weight of it. But something about the quality of Graham Pierce's attention made her not do that. Stubborn, she said. About the right things. He believed that every system failure was ultimately a communication failure, that the technical problem was almost always secondary to the human one. To someone not saying something, or someone not listening, or someone deciding that a signal didn't matter because of where it came from. She paused. He spent 20 years trying to get that idea taken seriously in the software industry. Mostly, he was ignored. Until today, Graham said. Emily looked at him. Today. Graham Pierce said carefully. His daughter walked into a room where she was about to be fired carrying 8 months of documentation that nobody had asked her to compile using a methodology he developed, and she prevented a billion-dollar disaster. And then she sat down with the CEO of an 11,000-person company and described the structural problem her father spent 20 years trying to articulate. He paused. I don't know if that's vindication, but it's something. Emily Carter looked at the cold coffee again, and for the first time that entire day her eyes filled, not from fear, not from relief, from something that didn't have a clean name, the complex specific grief of wishing that the person who deserved to see something was not there to see it. She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at Graham Pierce. 4 o'clock, she said. 4 o'clock, he confirmed. She stood up, picked up her folder and walked back to the 3rd floor. She had 2.5 hours. She was going to spend them reading the next section of the update log. Because the retrospective team was starting from 6 months ago, and she had already been tracking patterns that went back further than that, and no one was going to catch what she had caught unless she showed them exactly where to look. The work was not finished. It was only beginning. And Emily Carter had never been the kind of person who stopped before something was finished. The 4 o'clock meeting was in a smaller room, not the 38th floor conference room, but a mid-level space used for department head briefings, the kind of room that felt intentionally stripped of ceremony. A long table, 8 chairs, a single screen on the far wall. Daniel had chosen it deliberately. Emily understood. The 38th floor had the weight of the morning's crisis on it. This room was neutral ground. Daniel was already seated when Emily arrived. Victor Crane sat 2 chairs to his right. Beside Victor was a woman Emily had seen once in the building's lobby. Late 50s, sharp eyes behind narrow glasses. The particular posture of someone who occupied powerful rooms professionally and had learned to take up exactly as much space as was needed and not a millimeter more. Lorraine Webb, Daniel said. Board liaison and senior governance advisor. Lorraine did not offer her hand. She nodded once with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been given a full briefing and considered basic social ritual an inefficient use of meeting time. "Sit down, please," Lorraine said to Emily. Emily sat. "I've read the summary Graham Pierce submitted," Lorraine said, "and I've reviewed the email documentation you provided this morning. I have some questions, and I'd like you to answer them directly, not diplomatically, not with an eye to how the answers reflect on anyone in this room, just directly." "All right," Emily said. "When did you first identify the cumulative incompatibility pattern?" "Approximately 8 months ago." "When did you first formally report it?" 7 months and 3 weeks ago. The first email to Marcus Holt's department." "And the last communication you sent before today?" "Yesterday morning," Emily said. 7:42, to the General Engineering inbox. I had a flag in the overnight log that was consistent with the pattern reaching a critical threshold. I marked it urgent. Lorraine's expression did not change. "That email is in the documentation." "Tab 7, Emily said. Lorraine opened the folder in front of her and found tab 7. She read for approximately 20 seconds. "Yesterday morning?" she said, more to herself than to the room. 14 hours before the system failure. "Yes." "And no response was received?" "No." Lorraine closed the folder. She looked at Daniel Whitmore. "I'm going to need a full communication audit going back 12 months, she said. "Every email sent by operations staff to engineering or executive management that was either unanswered or auto-filtered. Every escalation that failed to escalate. I want a complete picture of the signal loss between your observational layer and your decision-making layer." Victor Crane said, "That audit is going to be significant in scope." "Yes," Lorraine said, "it is." Victor looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Lorraine. "The board will want context," Daniel said. The compressed update schedule was a board-level decision. If the audit shows that the compression contributed to, the audit will show what it shows, Lorraine said. The board will receive a complete report. That includes the decisions that created the conditions for this failure and the decisions that failed to recognize those conditions once they existed. And it includes, she glanced at Emily, the documentation of attempts to communicate those conditions that were not acted upon. The room was quiet. Emily was watching the dynamic between these three people. Lorraine's precision, Daniel's controlled discomfort, Victor's careful silence. She was watching a governance professional do the thing that governance professionals existed to do, hold a line that the people inside a situation were too close to it to hold themselves. "Emily," Lorraine said, "I want to ask you something that is outside the technical scope of this review." "Go ahead." "In 3 years at this company in a role that was clearly inadequate for your capabilities, why did you stay? You had the skills to go elsewhere. Arguably, to go somewhere significantly better compensated and better recognized." Emily considered this. It was the most direct question anyone had asked her all day, and in some ways the hardest, because the answer was not a single thing. It was layered, and some of the layers were private. "My father worked his entire career at companies that didn't recognize what he had," she said finally. "He died with a lot of unfinished work that mattered. Systems that would have been more stable industries that would have operated better if anyone had been willing to implement what he built." She paused. "I didn't want to move from company to company being frustrated. I wanted to find one place and actually fix it. Not perform fixing. Not make a presentation about the problem and then leave when the presentation wasn't received well." She looked at the table. "I thought if I stayed long enough and documented carefully enough and kept showing up, eventually somebody would look." The room absorbed this. Victor Crane exhaled slowly. "I looked today," Daniel said. "Yes," Emily said. "You did." "I looked because the system was failing, and I needed a solution, and you were the only person in the room who had one," he said. "That's not the same as looking because I saw you." Emily met his eyes. Daniel Whitmore was not a man who made admissions like that easily. She understood this. She also understood that he was making it here in this room in front of Lorraine Webb as a kind of commitment, not just an acknowledgement. "No," she said. "It's not the same. But it's a beginning." Lorraine Webb looked between them. "What I'm about to say is outside the scope of the governance review," she said with the particular tone of someone about to say the most important thing in the meeting while technically disclaiming its official status. "The structural change this company needs, the information architecture reform that Emily described to Daniel this morning, has nothing to do with today's system failure specifically. That failure is a symptom. The underlying condition is a company that has learned over years to filter out the signals that come from the people closest to the work. That is a cultural problem. Cultural problems don't get solved by policy memos or organizational charts." She looked at Emily. "They get solved by someone who understands both the problem and the people deciding to stay in the room long enough to change them." The silence was long. Emily understood what was being said, not the offer of a role Daniel had already gestured at that imprecisely in the conference room. This was something different. Lorraine Webb was describing something structural, something that would require Emily to operate not as a technical resource, but as an agent of institutional change in an institution that had spent 3 years treating her as a scheduling assistant. The difficulty of that was real. The resistance she would encounter was real. The people who would interpret her elevation as a threat were real. Emily thought about her father, about a man who had spent 20 years trying to change industries from the outside and had died without seeing it happen. She thought about the third floor, about the overnight logs, about the 14 emails, about the specific habitual pain of watching something go wrong that you could see coming and not being able to stop it because nobody with power was listening. She thought about the 41 seconds on the countdown clock, how close it had been, how easily it could have gone the other way. "I have a condition," Emily said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Any role I take, any structural authority I'm given, I want it paired with a formal review process for the other people in this building who are doing what I've been doing. Reading logs nobody else reads. Sending emails that don't get opened. Not because they want recognition, because they see something and they need it to reach someone who can act on it." She paused. "I am not the only Emily Carter in this company. I might be the only one whose specific set of circumstances put her in a room with the CEO. But there are people on the 3rd floor, and the 2nd floor, and the operations basement, who have been trying to show this company something real and have been systematically not heard. If I take any authority here, I want the first thing I use it for to be finding them." Lorraine Webb wrote something in her notebook. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, "Done." Victor Crane said slowly, "The org chart implications of that kind of review process are done." Daniel said again without looking at Victor. Victor closed his mouth. It was in that moment, not the dramatic moment of the countdown clock, not the green light on the system display, but this quieter, more specific moment that Emily Carter understood something had changed in a way that was going to be difficult to undo. Not just her position. The architecture of the company itself had bent slightly in the direction of something more honest. And she understood, with the pragmatic clarity her father had given her, that she would spend the next year testing whether that bend was permanent or whether it would slowly straighten itself back into the old shape. But that was the work. That was the actual work, the human work, that no amount of cascade mapping or dependency chain analysis could do for you. The meeting ended at 5:20. Emily walked back to the elevator alone. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, she stepped out and stood for a moment in the hallway. The floor was quieter now, end of the standard working day, most of the operations staff gone or packing up. A few overhead lights already cycling to energy save mode, the floor dimming slightly in sections. Her desk was where it had always been. The small corner space near the operations coordinator's hub. The neat stacks of folders. The laptop. The printed calendar for the week, with tomorrow's dates and times that she had organized for 3 different departments. She sat down. She opened the system log. There was a new flag, different from this morning's. Smaller, but consistent with the pattern she had been tracking in the earlier update cycles, the ones that predated 7.1 by several months. She documented it, timestamped it, attached the relevant log section. She opened a new email. This time the recipient was Graham Pierce. His response arrived in 4 minutes. "On it, team is aware. Can you join a call at 7? Emily typed back, "Yes." She picked up the cold coffee she had abandoned hours ago, looked at it, set it back down. She found a bottle of water in her bag. She drank half of it. She rolled up the folder she had carried to the 38th floor and carried back down again. She set it beside her laptop. She looked at the new flag in the system log. She began to read. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the early evening, shifting from the rhythm of commerce to the rhythm of people going home. The transition that happens in every building simultaneously and invisibly, the moment when the institution pauses and the humans inside it remember they exist outside of it. Emily Carter did not pause. She had never been the kind of person who let the rhythm of other people's endings determine her own. The flag was there. The pattern was continuing, and somewhere in the next layer of data, the next piece of the thing that needed to be found was waiting for the person patient enough to look for it. She looked. Across the building on the 38th floor, Daniel Whitmore was on the phone with the board chair. He was explaining what had happened. He was using words like systemic communication failure and unrecognized operational capacity and immediate structural review. The board chair was asking questions that Daniel was answering with a precision he would not have had this morning, because this morning he had not yet met Emily Carter. In the real sense of meeting someone, had not yet understood what she had been doing or why. Now he did. And the conversation he was having with the board chair was different because of it. Harder in some places, more honest in others, carrying the weight of a reckoning that organizations resisted until they could no longer afford to. On the second floor, Marcus Holt sat at his desk with the stack of Emily's emails in front of him. He had read all 14 of them. He had not read them this morning, or last week, or in any of the weeks before that. But he was reading them now in order, and with each one the picture clarified, not as a portrait of his failure, but as a portrait of a system that had made his failure easy and invisible and unremarkable until it became catastrophic. That distinction mattered to him. It did not excuse him. He understood that. But it mattered because it pointed toward the right kind of fix. Not the firing of one person and the promotion of another. Not a personnel change masquerading as a structural reform. Something harder. Something that required him to change how he ran his own department, how he had run it for years, in ways that would create friction and resistance from the people who had learned to operate within the old structure and would not welcome the disruption of it. He put the emails in order and stapled them together. He put them in a folder. He wrote Emily Carter's name on the tab, not as a reminder of what had happened, as a starting point for what came next. On the third floor, Emily found the flag she was looking for in the data from 14 months ago, a small, clean incompatibility signature early cycle. The kind of thing that looked like noise, if you weren't tracking the pattern across time, and looked like the origin point of everything if you were. She labeled it. She documented it. She added it to the retrospective file she had been building since 7 o'clock that morning, before the crisis, before the conference room, before Daniel Whitmore had said her name for the first time with the intention of truly knowing who she was. She saved the file. She had 5 minutes before the 7 o'clock call with Graham's team. She drank the other half of the water. She thought about her father. She thought I found it, Dad, not the origin point in the data. That was just data. She meant something larger and less precisely locatable, the place where the real failure had lived and the real correction was possible. Not in the system. In the room. In the people. In the specific stubborn necessary act of showing up and continuing to show up until the room changed around you rather than the other way around. She picked up the phone for the 7 o'clock call. Her voice when she spoke was steady. It had always been steady. That was the thing nobody in that conference room had bothered to learn until a countdown clock with 41 seconds left had forced them to stop and look at who was sitting in the corner of the room they had never truly seen. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. Daniel Whitmore had not slept. Not because he was anxious about the board he had faced difficult boards before, had delivered bad news in carefully constructed language, and watched it land, and watched the room recover. That was a skill he had built over 2 decades, and it did not fail him under pressure. He hadn't slept because he kept thinking about the email. The one dated 9 weeks ago. Emily's 7th attempt. The one addressed to Victor Crane's office. The one that had been confirmed received. He had read it 3 times after the 4 o'clock meeting. It was 6 sentences, the same as all her others. Precise, plain, unadorned by either apology or urgency, because she had learned by that point that neither apology nor urgency changed the response rate. She had stated what she found described its implications, asked for a response, and provided her contact information. She had done everything right, every single thing, and the company had done everything wrong in return. At 6:15 in the morning, Daniel called Victor. Victor answered on the second ring, which told Daniel that Victor also had not slept. "The board is going to ask about the compressed update schedule," Daniel said. "I need to know before 9 o'clock whether the decision to compress came from this floor or from the shareholders' meeting in February." Victor was quiet for 3 seconds. "Both," he said. "The shareholders set the announcement date. We set the schedule to meet it without pushing back on the date." "Without pushing back," Daniel repeated. "The announcement had already gone out," Victor said. "We thought we had the capacity." "We thought, or we hoped." Another silence. Longer this time. "We hoped," Victor said. Daniel absorbed this. "I'm going to tell the board that," he said. "Not a cleaned-up version. The actual sequence." Victor said, "Daniel, the audit Lorraine ordered is going to surface the same thing in 4 weeks," Daniel said. "If we try to frame it differently this morning, and the audit contradicts us, we lose every room we have left. The only way through this is straight through." Victor said nothing. Daniel said, "I need to know you're with me on this." The pause was long enough that Daniel felt for a moment the genuine uncertainty of not knowing which direction a person he had worked with for 11 years was going to turn. "I'm with you," Victor said. "But I want it noted that the compressed schedule was a collective decision." "It will be noted," Daniel said. "And so will every email that Emily Carter sent that nobody opened." Victor exhaled. "Yes," he said. "So will those." They hung up. Daniel sat with the phone in his hand for a long moment. He thought about what Emily had said in the small conference room. About the distance between the people who observed the system and the people who made decisions about it. About translators and noise and signal loss. About the specific institutional machinery that turned a clear warning into a filtered summary, into a soft recommendation, into an agenda item that never got placed. He thought about a company he had built from 11 people to 11,000. And he thought somewhere between 11 and 11,000 I stopped being able to hear the building. The board meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. There were 9 board members. 4 had joined remotely. Lorraine Webb sat at the far end of the table as governance liaison. Graham Pierce was present to address technical questions. Victor Crane sat to Daniel's left. Emily Carter was not in the room. Daniel had considered asking her to be there. He had decided against it, and he had told her why in a brief conversation that morning. "The board meeting is going to be about accountability," he had said. "Mine and Victor's, and the decision chain that created the conditions for what happened yesterday. That conversation needs to happen without you in the room, because if you're there, the conversation will shift to you, to your role, to your title, to why someone at your level was the one who caught this. And that's a useful conversation, but it's not the one that needs to happen first." Emily had listened to this carefully. "You're protecting the integrity of the accountability conversation," she said. "Yes. And making sure the board understands the structural failure before they meet the person who fixed it." "Yes," Daniel said. "Because if they meet you first, the story becomes about you. And the story needs to be about the system." Emily had nodded. "My father would have disagreed with that," she said. "He thought you always had to make it about a person. that people couldn't feel the weight of a system failure until they could see it in a face. Daniel had thought about that. "What do you think?" "I think you're both right," Emily said. "Which means the order matters." "System first," Daniel said. "Then person," Emily said. Yes. The board meeting went the way honest conversations go, when the people having them have decided in advance to be honest, difficult in the early portion, then clarifying, then quietly devastating in the way that the truth tends to be devastating when it has been deferred long enough that its arrival carries the weight of everything it was deferred by. The board chair, a 67-year-old woman named Patricia Ewan, who had seen enough corporate crisis management to recognize immediately when she wasn't being managed, listened to Daniel's account without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How many emails did she send?" 19, Daniel said, "counting the one yesterday morning." 19, Patricia repeated. Yes. Over 8 months. Yes. Patricia looked at Lorraine. The communication audit you've ordered. Timeline. I want preliminary findings in 2 weeks, Lorraine said. Full report in 4. Make it 3, Patricia said. 3. Lorraine agreed. Patricia looked at Daniel again. Who else in this company is doing what she was doing? Reading things nobody asked them to read, documenting things nobody asked them to document, sending communications into a system that was designed, even if not intentionally designed, to prevent them from arriving. Daniel said, "We don't know yet." "No," Patricia said. "You don't. And that's the finding, Daniel. That's the actual finding, not the system failure, not the compressed schedule. The finding is that you built a company that was systematically better at filtering out knowledge from below than it was at using it." The room was quiet. The board members who had been with Westbridge longest, the 3 who had been there since the early years, who had watched it grow from a startup into an institution, looked uncomfortable in the particular way of people who are hearing a description of something they participated in the building of and are now being asked to assess honestly. "We'd like to meet her," Patricia said. "She'll be available after this meeting," Daniel said. "Good." Patricia looked at her notes. "I want her in front of this board within the week. Not to answer for anything, to describe what she built, why she built it, and what it would take to institutionalize it, in her words, without a communications team cleaning them up first." Victor Crane shifted slightly in his chair. Daniel said, "Done." When the board meeting ended and Daniel walked back through the executive floor, his assistant met him at the elevator with a message. Emily had called up from the 3rd floor. There was a new finding in the retrospective analysis. The team had confirmed a second cumulative incompatibility chain in an earlier update cycle, not critical yet, but consistent with the same pattern that had produced yesterday's near failure. Daniel read the message. He turned to his assistant. "Tell her I'll be downstairs in 10 minutes. His assistant blinked. In 11 years, Daniel Whitmore had gone to the 3rd floor exactly once, for an all-hands meeting that he had left after 20 minutes. "Downstairs?" Daniel said again. "3rd floor." "Yes, sir," his assistant said. He took the elevator down. Emily was at her desk when he arrived. She had the retrospective analysis open on one screen and the raw system log on another. The folder, the same folder she had carried to the 38th floor the day before, was to her right, updated with new tabs. She looked up when she heard him approach. "You came down," she said. "The finding is here," Daniel said. "So I came here." It was a small thing. She understood that. He was still the CEO. She was still a 24-year-old assistant. The power differential had not dissolved overnight. But the gesture of it mattered. The decision to come to where the work was, rather than summoning the work to where he was. She turned her screen toward him and walked him through what the retrospective team had found. The second incompatibility chain was older, originating 14 months ago, exactly where Emily had located the early signature the night before. It had not progressed to a critical threshold because the update frequency in that cycle had been slower, giving the system more stabilization time between changes. But it was there dormant, and under certain load conditions, it could be triggered. "How certain are you?" Daniel asked. 80%, Emily said. "The remaining 20 is variables I can't model from the log data alone. I'd need the original test environment records from that cycle." "Graham can get those." "He's already requested them," Emily said. "I called him at 6 this morning." Daniel looked at her. "You called Graham at 6 this morning. I found the signature at 5:40, she said. "I waited 20 minutes before calling because I wanted to verify the pattern match before I brought anyone else in." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He was doing the calculation, not technical human. The calculation of someone trying to understand what it looked like to be Emily Carter. To be the person who woke at 5:40 in the morning to verify a data pattern before calling a senior colleague because she had learned over years of not being believed to make certain before she asked anyone to believe her. "The board wants to meet you," he said. Emily looked up from the screen. "When?" "Within the week. Patricia Ewan, the board chair, wants to hear from you directly. In your words," she said, "not cleaned up." "What do they want to know?" "What you built. Why you built it. What it would take to make it institutional," Daniel said. "The framework. The methodology. The communication structure you described yesterday. They want it out of your head and into the company architecture." Emily was quiet. "That's a significant thing to ask," she said. "Yes," Daniel said. "It means I'll have to describe the failures clearly, including the ones at the executive level, in front of the board." "I know," Daniel said. "I already told them the story straight. They know what the emails show. They know about the compressed schedule. The room you're walking into has already heard the uncomfortable version. What they need from you is the forward version. What does good look like?" Emily turned back to the screen for a moment. She was thinking, and Daniel had the same sense he'd had in the conference room of someone whose thinking was not performed. She was not composing an answer for his benefit. She was genuinely working something through. "I want to bring something with me to that board meeting," she said. "What?" "Names," she said. "I want to spend this week finding the other people in this building who've been doing what I've been doing. Reading things nobody asked them to read. Sending things nobody opened. I want to walk into that board meeting with their names and what they found and what happened to what they sent. Because if I walk in there and describe a better system in theory, the board will approve it in theory. But if I walk in there with 6 or 7 people who are currently sitting on real findings that haven't reached anyone with authority, then it's not a theory anymore." Daniel looked at her. He thought she's been thinking about this since yesterday. He thought probably since before yesterday. "How do you plan to find them?" he said. "The same way I found the system anomaly," she said. "I follow the pattern. People who repeatedly send communications to departments above their level and stop receiving responses, that's a data pattern. It exists in the email server logs. I know what it looks like because I lived it." She paused. "I'm not looking for people who complained. I'm looking for people who persisted." "You want access to the company's internal email analytics?" "Yes. That requires authorization from IT governance." "I know," Emily said. "I was hoping you might make a call." Daniel looked at her for one more moment. "Done," he said. He pulled out his phone and made the call standing at her desk in the operations bay, while 2 junior staff members on the other side of the floor tried very hard to look like they weren't watching the CEO make a direct authorization call from the 3rd floor. The authorization came through in 40 minutes. Emily spent the rest of the morning running the pattern analysis she had described. The parameters were specific. She was looking for a signature, not the content of communications, which she deliberately excluded from the search to preserve privacy, but the metadata. Frequency of upward communications from sub-manager level staff. Response rates. Time to first response. Pattern of tapering the slow reduction in frequency that indicated someone had been sending things and had begun gradually to stop. The algorithm she built in 3 hours to run this analysis was the same class of approach her father had used to detect failure signatures in software systems, applied not to code, but to human behavior inside an institutional system. Pattern recognition, anomaly identification, the same tools, different signal. By 2 in the afternoon, she had 6 names. Not 6 random names. 6 people who matched the specific combination of factors she had been looking for: high initial communication frequency, persistent follow-up, progressive reduction in attempts, and a current status of either minimal communication or silence. People who had tried and been not quite ignored but absorbed by the system's indifference, and who had eventually done what systems trained them to do: stopped trying. She looked at the 6 names for a long time. She knew one of them, a logistics coordinator named Jerome Watts, who worked 2 floors below her. She had eaten lunch with him twice. He had mentioned both times something about data patterns in the shipping logistics system that he thought were being miscategorized. She had half listened because she had been in the middle of her own tracking. She had said both times, "Have you reported it?" He had said both times, "I tried," and the conversation had moved on. She called Jerome Watts. He answered on the 3rd ring with the careful professional neutrality of someone who had learned to be non-committal on incoming calls. "Jerome," she said, "it's Emily Carter. Operations 3rd floor. We've had lunch twice." A pause. "I remember," he said. Is everything okay?" "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. The data patterns you mentioned in the shipping logistics system, what happened when you reported them?" A longer pause. 3 emails, he said. "To my department head, 1 to the logistics director, no responses." "When did you send the last one?" "About 5 months ago," he said. "After that I figured you figure." "I know," Emily said. "I know exactly what you figure." She paused. "I want you to come to a meeting, next week, and I want you to bring whatever documentation you have." "A meeting with who?" "The board of directors," she said. The silence that followed was long enough that she checked her phone to confirm the call was still connected. "Emily," Jerome said slowly. "I'm a logistics coordinator." "I know," she said. "I'm a junior operations assistant. Come to the meeting." She called the other 5 names that afternoon. 2 of them had left the company, 1 3 months ago, 1 6. She noted that in the file she was building. Their departures would need to be part of the story she told the board, because people leaving was how a company permanently lost the knowledge it had refused to use. The remaining 4 were still at Westbridge. All 4, after initial hesitation that ranged from polite skepticism to visible disbelief, agreed to come to the meeting. Each one, when she asked about their most recent attempt to communicate what they had found, gave her the same answer in different words. "I figured it wasn't worth it anymore. I thought maybe I was wrong. I stopped because nothing was happening and I needed to protect my job. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility." Emily wrote each answer down. Not because she needed the record she would remember every word. She wrote them down because she wanted the board to read them. She wanted Patricia Ewan and the 9 board members, and Daniel Whitmore and Victor Crane, to see these sentences on paper. To understand that the most expensive thing a company could do was create an environment where its most observant people taught themselves that observation was dangerous. She was building the case, not for herself, for the next version of the company, the version that would have to exist on the other side of this reckoning. At 4:30, Marcus Holt appeared at her desk. She had not expected this. He stood at the edge of her workspace with the careful, considered posture of a man who had thought about whether to do this and had decided to do it anyway, knowing it would be uncomfortable. "I read all of them," he said. She did not need to ask what he meant. "I know," she said. "The 7th one," he said. "The one from 9 weeks ago. I found it in a filtered folder. My assistant had set up a rule that auto-filed communications from operations staff below manager level into a review folder. It was supposed to be a time management tool." He paused. "I hadn't checked the review folder in 4 months." Emily looked at him. "A lot of things went into that folder," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. "I've been looking at it this afternoon, your emails, and others." He stopped. "There's a message in there from an engineer named Priya Nair, sent 6 months ago, about a hardware fault pattern in the server cluster. She sent 3 follow-ups. All 4 went into the review folder. She left the company 2 months ago. Emily stilled. Priya Nair was one of the 2 names she had flagged as departed employees. Do you know what the hardware fault pattern was? Emily asked. I had Graham look at it an hour ago, Marcus said. His voice had changed. Something in it had gone quieter and heavier. It's real. It's not critical yet, but it's real. And we lost the person who identified it. The weight of this settled between them. Not just an email unread. A person lost. A finding lost with them. I want to do something, Marcus said. I'm not sure exactly what shape it takes yet, but the auto-filtering system in my department that's gone, starting today. Everything from every level comes directly, and I'm going to read it. He paused. I don't know if that's enough. I suspect it's not, but it's where I'm starting. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Priya Nair, she said. Do you have her contact information from the exit records? I can get it. I'd like to reach out to her, Emily said. What she found, if the board is going to understand the full cost of this, they need to understand it includes people who left. Marcus Holt looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not the controlled, calibrated expression he had worn in the conference room. Not the chastened posture of this afternoon's arrival. Something older and more unguarded. She was good, he said quietly. Priya. I didn't know her well because of the filter. But I've been reading her emails this afternoon. She was very good. Yes, Emily said. She probably was. I'll get you her number tonight, Marcus said. He left. Emily sat for a moment with the information that Priya Nair's hardware fault pattern was real, and that Priya Nair was gone, and that these 2 facts were connected by a filtered folder that no one had checked in 4 months. Then she opened her file and added Priya Nair's name. Not in the departed category, in a separate section at the top. Names the company needs to go find. She had 6 people coming to the board meeting. She now had a 7th name, not present, not available to walk into a room and speak for herself, but there in the record. There in the email sitting in a folder that should have been an inbox. There in the hardware fault pattern that was still running uncorrected in the server cluster. The company's failures were not abstract. They had names. They had email addresses. They had exit dates stamped on human resource records, and they had findings that were still out there in the system, unresolved, waiting. Emily Carter was going to bring every single one of them into that boardroom, not as victims, as evidence. Evidence of what was possible when a company decided finally and irrevocably to stop filtering out the people who were paying the closest attention. The board meeting was 6 days away. She had 6 days to build the most important presentation of her life for an audience of 9 people who had the authority to change how 11,000 people related to their own institution. She was not going to waste a single hour of it. She opened a new document. She typed 1 line at the top. What this company knows, that it doesn't know, it knows. She stared at that line for exactly 4 seconds. Then she started writing. The document Emily had started that Tuesday evening was 41 pages by Friday morning. Not 41 pages of theory. Not 41 pages of recommendations wrapped in corporate language and organized by strategic pillar and supported by industry benchmarks. 41 pages of specific named dated documented reality. Cases. People. Findings. Emails sent into silence. Patterns identified and ignored. And woven through all of it like a structural thread holding the whole thing together. A methodology for preventing it from happening again. That was built not on policy, but on architecture. The way information moved through a company, who had access to it, who was trained to look at it, and what happened when the people closest to the original signal tried to pass it upward. She had called Priya Nair on Wednesday evening. Marcus Holt had sent the number that night as promised. Emily had stared at it for a while before dialing, thinking about what it meant to call someone who had left. Someone the company had not chased. Someone who had done the right thing 3 times in 6 months, and had received each time the institutional equivalent of a closed door, and had eventually stopped knocking and walked away. Priya answered after 4 rings. This is Priya. Priya, my name is Emily Carter. I'm a junior operations assistant at Westbridge. We haven't met. A pause. Careful. The pause of someone who had not expected to receive a call from Westbridge and was deciding how to feel about it. Okay, Priya said. I know you left 2 months ago, Emily said. And I know why you left is complicated, and I'm not going to pretend this call isn't also complicated. But I want to tell you something, and then I want to ask you something, and you can say no to both. Go ahead, Priya said. The hardware fault pattern you reported 6 months ago, Emily said. I want you to know that it's been confirmed. Graham Pierce's team looked at it yesterday. It's real. You were right. The silence that followed was long. When Priya spoke, her voice had changed. Not broken, controlled carefully so, but something underneath the control had shifted. I knew I was right, she said. I know, Emily said. That's actually the thing I wanted to say first. I wanted to say it before anything else because I think you deserve to hear it plainly. You were right. You saw something real. You reported it correctly. The failure was not in you. A longer silence. Thank you, Priya said. And the 2 words carried the specific weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be said to someone. The second thing, Emily said. Next week I'm presenting to the board of directors. I'm bringing documentation of what happened. Not just your case, there are others. And I'm asking them to institutionalize a structural change that would make it impossible for what happened to you to happen the same way again. She paused. I'd like to include your findings in the presentation, your emails, the confirmed fault pattern, your name if you're willing. Because the board needs to understand that the cost of this failure isn't just a near miss on a product launch. The cost includes people like you, people the company lost because it didn't know how to listen. Priya was quiet for a while. Will it change anything? She said. Not cynically, genuinely asking. I don't know, Emily said. I think it might. I think the conditions are right in a way they haven't been before, but I won't promise you something I can't guarantee. Another pause. Okay, Priya said. Use my name. Use all of it. Emily wrote Priya Nair's name at the top of the first page of the document, not because Priya's case was the most technically significant, because it was the most humanly significant, because it was the case that showed most clearly what the company had been willing to discard without noticing it had discarded it. By Thursday afternoon, all 6 of the internal employees Emily had contacted had confirmed their attendance at the board meeting. 2 of them had sent her their documentation, the emails, the findings, the evidence of what they had tried to communicate and what had happened when they had tried. The other 4 had varying degrees of documentation, and Emily worked with each of them individually, by phone and in person, to reconstruct what they could from memory, and from whatever records remained accessible. Jerome Watts had 3 emails, partial system data, and a clear memory of every conversation he had tried to have about the logistics pattern. He turned out to be a precise and organized thinker, who had been quietly frustrated for 11 months, and who, when given a structured outlet for that frustration, produced analysis that Emily found genuinely impressive. How long have you been tracking this? She asked him Thursday afternoon. Almost a year, he said. I started noticing it after a routing update last October. I thought I was seeing things at first, so I waited 2 months before I reported it. I wanted to be sure. And when you reported it, my department head said she'd pass it along. Jerome looked at his hands. I don't know if she did. I never heard anything. 3 emails later, I figured she hadn't. Emily looked at the data Jerome had assembled. It was not as refined as her own work. He had not had her father's methodology to draw from, had not had 8 months of daily practice reading raw logs. But the pattern he had found was real, and his instinct to wait and confirm before reporting was the instinct of someone who understood that credibility was a finite resource, and had learned in the specific way that people in his position learned things to be conservative with it. You should have been heard the first time, Emily said. Jerome looked up at her. Something in his face shifted the specific expression of someone who has been reasonable about an unreasonable situation for so long that being told plainly it was unreasonable becomes unexpectedly moving. Yeah, he said. I should have been. You will be next week, Emily said, in front of the people who can actually do something about it. Jerome Watts nodded and went back to his documentation. Emily went back to hers. The night before the board meeting, she was at her desk at 11 o'clock. Graham Pierce had called at 9 to check on her, and she had told him she was fine, and he had said he would be available at 7 in the morning if she needed to walk through anything technical, and she had thanked him, and they had hung up. At 11:15 her phone rang. It was Daniel Whitmore. She answered. "You're still there," he said. "Yes." "How long have you been there?" She looked at the time. "About 15 hours. A pause. "Emily." "The document is done," she said. "I'm not working on the document anymore. I'm reading my father's notes." A different kind of pause. "He had notebooks," she said. "He kept them his whole career. I brought 3 of them with me tonight. I've been reading them." She stopped. "He wrote about this. Not this company, but this problem. The signal and the noise. The distance between the people who see and the people who decide. He had a whole section about what he called institutional deafness. He said it wasn't malicious. He said it was structural. That organizations didn't ignore signals because they wanted to, they ignored them because they had built themselves over time into shapes that made certain signals unreachable." She paused again. "He spent 20 years trying to describe that to people who weren't ready to hear it." Daniel was quiet. "And tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow I'm going to describe it to people who are," Emily said. "I keep thinking about that, about timing, about how the same idea lands differently depending on when you say it." She looked at the notebook on her desk. He wasn't wrong. He was just early. And there was no 41-second countdown clock to make anyone listen. Daniel said, "He would have been proud of you." Emily pressed her lips together. "He would have had 17 technical corrections for the presentation," she said. Daniel said, "Get some sleep." "A few more pages," she said. "Emily." "Good night, Daniel," she said. She read until midnight. Then she closed the notebook, gathered her materials, and went home. The board meeting convened at 9 o'clock sharp. Patricia Ewan sat at the center of the table with the 8 other board members arranged around her. Daniel was there. Victor was there. Lorraine Webb. Graham Pierce. And at one side of the room, arranged in a small group that did not look like a group because they had not known each other before. This week, 6 employees of Westbridge Technologies, ranging in title from junior logistics coordinator to mid-level data analyst, all of whom had been doing something the company didn't know it needed, and had been doing it in silence. Emily stood at the front. She looked at the room. She looked at Jerome Watts, who was holding a folder he had organized himself with tabs, which Emily recognized as the specific behavior of someone who had prepared very carefully, because they understood that this was the first time in a long time they were going to be believed. She looked at Patricia Ewan, who was looking back at her with the level attention of someone who had already decided this meeting mattered and was prepared for it to be difficult. She looked at Daniel Whitmore sitting to Patricia's left, who gave her a single small nod. She began. "The title of what I'm about to describe," Emily said, "is also a question. What does this company know that it doesn't know it knows?" She paused for exactly 1 beat. "The answer is more than any of you can currently measure, because the measurement systems you have were not built to capture what people at certain levels of this organization observe and report. They were built to aggregate, filter, and summarize. And in the process of doing those things, they systematically remove the specificity that makes information actionable." Patricia Ewan watched her without moving. "8 months ago," Emily said, "I began tracking a pattern in the system update logs. I did this without being asked. I did it because the pattern was there, and I could see it, and I could not make myself unsee it once I had." She opened the document in front of her to the first page. "Over 8 months, I sent 19 communications to 5 different departments. The response rate was 0. The pattern I was tracking progressed as unchecked patterns do, until it produced a near-catastrophic system failure 48 hours before your most significant product launch." She let that sit for a moment. "I am not describing this because it is about me," she said. I am describing it because it is also about them. She turned slightly toward the 6 people at the side of the room. These are 6 employees who are currently at Westbridge. Each of them in the last 14 months identified something real, a pattern, a fault, an anomaly, a risk, and attempted to communicate it through the appropriate channels. Each of them received responses that ranged from inadequate to non-existent. Each of them, at some point, began to reduce their reporting frequency. And most of them, by the time I contacted them last week, had stopped reporting entirely. She looked at the board members one by one. Jerome Watts, logistics coordinator, identified a routing anomaly 11 months ago. He sent 4 communications. He received 1 automated acknowledgement. She paused. Sandra Chen, data integrity analyst, found a categorization error in the customer database 18 months ago that is currently affecting approximately 12% of our user segmentation data. She sent 7 communications over 4 months. She received 2 responses that both asked her to submit a formal ticket through a system that, as I have documented in Appendix 3, routes all analyst-level tickets into a queue that has a current processing backlog of 9 months. The room was very still. David Park, Emily continued, and her voice was steady. Entry-level infrastructure monitor identified a latency pattern in the Pacific Northwest server cluster 8 months ago, consistent with early-stage hardware degradation. He sent 2 emails and then stopped because his direct manager told him, and I am quoting from the email exchange documented in tab 9, that he should, quote, focus on his assigned monitoring tasks and leave pattern analysis to the senior engineering team. She looked at the room. David Park has been doing pattern analysis on his own time ever since, without telling anyone, because he was told it wasn't his job. David Park, sitting at the side of the room, looked at his hands. He was 26 years old. He had been at Westbridge for 2 years. He had in 2 years sent 14 unauthorized pattern analyses to a personal email account because he had nowhere else to send them, and he could not make himself stop looking. Emily had found him on the 3rd day. She had almost not found him because his internal communication frequency had dropped to 0. He had stopped sending entirely, which meant he didn't show up in the moderate reduction pattern she was searching for. She had found him because she had expanded the search to include people who had gone from frequent reporting to complete silence within a 6-week window, which was a sharper drop than the pattern she originally designed for. When she had called David Park, he had said, "How did you find me?" And she had said, "The same way you find things. I looked for the pattern." He had been quiet for a very long time. Then he had said, "Okay." Emily reached the midpoint of the presentation and paused. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "The people I've described are not exceptional. They are not extraordinary talents who happen to survive in a hostile environment against all odds. They are normal, competent, observant employees who did what competent employees do. They paid attention to the work and they tried to communicate what they found." She let that settle. The exceptional thing is not what they did. The exceptional thing is that they kept doing it after the company made it clear repeatedly and systematically that it wasn't listening. Patricia Yuen said, "What made them keep going?" It was the first time she had spoken since Emily began. Emily turned to look at her directly. "Different things?" Emily said. For Jerome, it was stubbornness. For Sandra, it was a specific kind of professional conscience she described as not being able to leave a known error uncorrected. For David? She glanced at David Park. "Would you like to answer that yourself?" David Park looked up. He had not expected to speak. Emily had told him he could if he wanted to. She had not required it. He looked at Patricia Yuen. "My dad worked on a manufacturing line for 30 years, he said. His voice was quieter than Emily's and less practiced, but it was direct. He used to say that the difference between a good line and a bad line wasn't the equipment. It was whether the people running it felt like their observations mattered. He said the lines that failed were always the ones where the workers had stopped believing anyone was listening." He paused. "I didn't want to be someone who stopped believing, even when it felt like nobody was." The boardroom was very quiet. Patricia Yuen looked at David Park for a long moment. Then she looked at Emily. "Continue," she said. The twist came 40 minutes into the presentation, and it came from a direction Emily had not fully anticipated. She had been walking the board through the structural proposal, the information architecture reform, the direct reporting pathway, the changes to filtering and escalation protocols, when Victor Crane, who had been silent for the entire session, said, "Can I say something?" Patricia looked at him. "Go ahead." Victor Crane had the expression of a man who had spent the last 4 days in a particular kind of private reckoning. The kind that happened when a person who was used to being right about things discovered that they had been wrong about something large and had had to sit with that discovery long enough that they couldn't manage it into a more comfortable shape. "I want to address the people in this room directly," he said. He looked at the 6 employees at the side of the room, at Jerome Watts, at Sandra Chen, at David Park, at the others. "I'm the chief operating officer of this company. What Emily has described, the filtering systems, the escalation failures, the auto-routing that categorized your communications as low priority, those systems existed under my operational authority. I didn't build them to ignore you. I built them to manage volume. But the result was the same." He paused. "I didn't know your names before this week. I should have. That's not an excuse. It's a statement of the problem, and I own it." The room absorbed this. Not because corporate apologies were unusual, they happened in various degrees of performance all the time, but because the quality of Victor Crane's words was different from that. It was not managed. It was not crafted by a communications team. It had the specific texture of something a person had actually thought about for days, and had then said plainly without a script. Jerome Watts looked at Victor Crane for a long moment. Then he said, "I appreciate that. 3 words. No drama in them. No forgiveness exactly, but no hostility either. Just the acknowledgement of one person to another that something real had been said." Victor nodded once. And then something happened that Emily had not planned and had not expected. Sandra Chen, sitting 2 seats from Jerome, opened her folder and placed a single document on the table in front of her. "I have one more thing," Sandra said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. "In addition to the database categorization error, I reported the one in the appendix. I found something else. 4 months ago. I didn't report it." The room changed. Emily turned to look at Sandra. Sandra looked at Emily. "I didn't report it because by that point I had 7 unanswered emails, and I had decided that the cost of sending another one that disappeared was higher than the benefit." She paused. "I know that was wrong. I know I should have kept trying. But I want to be honest about it, because I think the honest version is more useful than the version where we pretend that people never stop trying." "What did you find?" Emily asked. Sandra passed the document to Emily. Emily read it. The room waited. What Sandra had found was a systematic error in the user data validation protocol, not the categorization error she had previously reported, but a separate issue deeper in the data architecture. An error that under specific conditions could produce false positive authentication approvals. In plain language, under the right circumstances, the system could grant access to accounts that it should not have granted access to. Emily looked up from the document. She looked at Graham Pierce. Graham Pierce's face had gone very still, in the way it went still when he was rapidly processing something significant. "How often are those conditions met?" he asked Sandra directly. "Based on my analysis," Sandra said, "approximately once every 40 to 60,000 authentication events. And our current daily authentication volume, roughly 2.8 million, Sandra said. Graham Pierce did the arithmetic in approximately 3 seconds. 46 to 70 potential unauthorized authentications per day, he said. The boardroom went very quiet. Patricia Ewan said, "Currently?" "Currently," Sandra said. "Yes." Emily looked at the room. At Patricia Ewan, who was very still. At Daniel Whitmore, who had his eyes on Sandra with an expression of someone absorbing a new weight. At Graham Pierce, who had already pulled out his phone to begin the technical chain that would need to start immediately. At the 6 people who had come into this room as employees, who had been not quite ignored, but not quite heard, and who were now sitting at a table where every word they said was landing with the full gravity it deserved. This was the thing Emily thought. This was the exact thing her father had always meant. Not the drama of the countdown clock, not the 41 seconds. Those made for a good story, but they were not the core of the lesson. The core of the lesson was Sandra Chen. 4 months of silence. A finding sitting in a folder on a desk unreported because the company had trained the person who made it to believe that trying was not worth the cost. How many other Sandra Chens were there? In 11,000 employees. How many findings were sitting in folders or in people's heads or in personal email accounts, like David Park's 14 unauthorized analyses, real, confirmed, actionable, and completely invisible to the people who could act on them? Patricia Yuen said, "Emily." Emily looked at her. "The structural proposal you've outlined," Patricia said. "The direct reporting pathway, the signal integrity protocol, the cross-level review process. How long to implement?" 6 months to have a functional first version, Emily said. 12 months to have it tested and calibrated. 18 months to have it integrated deeply enough that it's part of how the company actually operates, rather than a system people work around. "And who leads the implementation?" Emily paused. Not because she didn't know the answer. She had known the answer since Tuesday, since she typed the first line of the 41-page document. She paused because saying it required something, not confidence exactly. She had that. It required the specific courage of claiming something that the world had been telling you for years was above your station. "I do," she said. Patricia Yuen looked at her steadily. "With what authority?" she said. Not as a challenge, as a governance question. The practical question of what structure would give Emily the institutional weight to make the changes she was describing. "That's your decision," Emily said. "I can describe what I need functionally. I need to be able to communicate directly with every level of the organization without a filter. I need access to the communication analytics to identify signal loss patterns on an ongoing basis. I need the authority to convene cross-level reviews when I identify a finding that isn't being addressed. And I need people." She looked at the 6 employees at the side of the room. "Specifically, I need these 6 people, and I need you to find the 2 who left and ask them to come back. And I need whatever Priya Nair found in the hardware fault pattern to be the first case that the new process addresses." Patricia Yuen looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Emily. "You said your father would have had 17 technical corrections," he said. "At least," Emily said. "What do you think he would have said about this moment specifically?" Emily thought about the notebooks, about the 3 she had brought to the office the night before, about the section on institutional deafness and the sentence she had read just before midnight in her father's handwriting, the last sentence of that section, underlined twice, which she had not included in the 41-page document because it had felt too personal. She said it now. He wrote, "The organization that learns to hear what it has been ignoring will always outperform the one that is still listening only to itself. But the hard part is never the learning. The hard part is admitting that you were deaf in the first place." The boardroom was silent. Patricia Yuen wrote something in her notebook. She did not show anyone what she wrote. Then she looked up and said, "We'll need a vote on the formal authorization." The vote took 11 minutes. It was unanimous. In the weeks that followed, Westbridge Technologies began the process of becoming a different kind of company. Not quickly, not without friction. The changes Emily had described were structural, and structural changes always encountered resistance from the people who had built their professional identities within the old structure. There were department heads who felt their authority was being circumvented. There were senior managers who interpreted the new reporting pathway as a criticism of their management, rather than a correction of the system around them. There were people, and this was predictable, and Emily had predicted it, who tried to use the new process as a political tool rather than an informational one, who sent communications upward, not because they had genuine findings, but because the new channel existed and seemed to confer importance on the person using it. Emily handled each of these frictions with the same combination of patience and directness that she had carried into the 38th floor conference room. She met with every resistant department head individually, not to argue with them, to listen to the specific shape of their resistance and to address it specifically. She found that most of the resistance came not from malice, but from fear. The fear of being exposed, of having their department's signal loss history examined, of being held accountable for emails that had gone unanswered and findings that had been quietly buried. To each of them, she said the same thing in different ways. The audit is going to happen whether or not you cooperate with the process. What you control is whether the record shows you were part of the solution. Some of them cooperated immediately. Others took longer. Marcus Holt was not among the resistant ones. 3 days after the board meeting, he had convened his entire engineering department and described in plain terms what had happened. Not the managed version, the real one, the auto filter folder, the unread emails. Priya Nair's departure. He had named his own failure clearly and described what he was changing and asked his team to tell him what they had been not reporting and why. The meeting lasted 3 hours. He called Emily afterward. 14 things, he said. 14, she said. 14 things my engineers have been sitting on. Not all critical. Some of them are genuinely minor. But 14 things that someone in this department saw and decided weren't worth reporting. He paused. I'm sending them to Graham tonight. He'll triage. Thank you, Marcus, Emily said. One of them, Marcus said, has been sitting with an engineer named Tom Reeves for 7 months. He's 22. First job out of college. He saw something in a diagnostic pattern. His first month here, reported it to his team lead, was told it was a false positive, and has been watching it persist for 7 months without saying anything, because he was new, and he figured he must be wrong. Marcus paused. He's not wrong. Add him to the review list, Emily said. Already done, Marcus said. Priya Nair came back. Not immediately. It took 3 weeks, 2 conversations with Daniel Whitmore, 1 with Patricia Ewan, and a formal offer that included a title and compensation that reflected what her work had actually been worth, rather than what a mid-level engineer's standard package permitted. She arrived on a Tuesday morning. Emily was at her desk, a different desk now on the 20th floor, in a space that was not the 3rd floor and not the 38th, but somewhere between them, which felt right when her phone rang. I'm in the lobby, Priya said. I'll come down, Emily said. They met in the building's lobby for the first time in person. Priya was 30 years old, tall, with the direct gaze of someone who had learned to hold eye contact specifically because the world had given her reasons not to. They shook hands. Your hardware fault pattern, Emily said. Graham's team has already started the correction. It'll take 6 weeks to fully resolve. I know, Priya said. He briefed me last week. How does it feel? Emily asked. To have it confirmed. Priya was quiet for a moment. Like when you know you locked the door, she said. But you went back to check anyway, and it was locked the whole time. Emily understood that exactly. David Park's 14 personal email analyses were formally incorporated into the infrastructure monitoring protocol. He was given a role title that matched what he had actually been doing for 2 years, and a direct reporting line that bypassed the chain that had told him to stop doing it. He spent one afternoon moving the files from his personal account to the company system. Jerome Watts's routing anomaly was corrected in week 2. Sandra Chen's authentication error took longer 6 weeks of full security review, and a patch that Graham Pierce described as one of the most significant quiet fixes Westbridge had made in 5 years. Significant not because of the damage it had already done, but because of what it would have done left uncorrected for another 12 months. Sandra, when Graham told her this, said, I reported it 4 months ago. I know, Graham said. Under the new system. Under the new system. Graham said, it would have reached someone who could act on it within 48 hours of your first report. Sandra nodded. Okay, she said. That's what matters. 6 months after the board meeting, Westbridge published its first Signal Integrity Report, an internal document distributed to all 11,000 employees that described the new communication architecture, the findings that had been surfaced through it, and the outcomes those findings had produced. It included the names of every person who had contributed a confirmed finding in the first 6 months. Priya Nair's name was at the top. Not because Emily had arranged it that way. Because her finding the hardware fault pattern she had reported from inside the company and then carried with her when she left had been confirmed as the earliest detectable precursor to the system instability that had nearly destroyed the product launch. She had seen it first. She had reported it first. She had been ignored first. The report said this plainly. Emily had written that section herself, and she had not softened it. On the morning the report was distributed, Daniel Whitmore stopped by Emily's 20th floor desk. "It landed," he said. "How?" "I've had 14 department heads email me before 9 o'clock, he said. 11 asking questions about the new process. 2 requesting meetings to discuss their own department's communication histories." He paused. "One telling me he thinks the report was too critical of existing leadership." "Which one?" Emily said. "Doesn't matter," Daniel said. "He's in a meeting with Lorraine Webb this afternoon." Emily almost smiled. Daniel sat down in the chair across from her desk. Not at the head of a table. In a chair across a desk, the way 2 people sat when they were having an actual conversation. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want the honest answer, not the professional one." "All right," Emily said. "Do you think this is going to hold?" he said. "In 5 years? In 10? When the people who were in that conference room have moved on or retired, when the urgency of what happened has faded into institutional memory, when the path of least resistance starts pulling the company back toward the old shape, do you think what you built will hold?" Emily looked at him. "No," she said. Daniel was quiet. "Not by itself," Emily said. "Nothing holds by itself. Systems drift. Organizations optimize for comfort. People find workarounds for processes that create friction, and the new process creates friction, which is the point of it, but friction is also what gets routed around when nobody is watching." She paused. "It holds if the people inside it keep choosing to hold it. If every time it's easier to ignore a signal someone decides not to. If every time it costs something to listen, someone pays the cost anyway." She looked at the desk. "My father didn't believe you could build a system that replaced that choice. He believed you could build a system that made the choice easier, that removed the structural obstacles, so that when a person wanted to do the right thing, the organization got out of the way instead of blocking them." "Is that what you built?" Daniel asked. "That's what I started," Emily said. "The building takes longer than 6 months." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "Your father would have had 17 corrections," he said. "At least," she said. "What correction would he have for the system as it stands right now?" Emily thought about the notebooks, about the last entry she had read the night before the board meeting in handwriting that had gotten slightly less precise in the later years, as his hands had begun to show the small frailties of age. "He would have said it's too clean," she said. "He always said the designs that looked elegant on paper were the ones that broke most dramatically in practice, because elegance required assumptions about human behavior that human beings reliably violated. He would have wanted more redundancy, more overlap, more places where the signal could arrive even if one pathway failed." She paused. "More people like Jerome and Sandra and David, distributed through the organization so that no single node could fail without the signal still getting through somewhere." "More people," Daniel said. "More people," Emily said. "That's the answer to almost every system design problem, not a better algorithm. More people who know what they're looking for and are given permission to say what they see." Daniel stood up. He straightened his jacket. He was about to go back to the 38th floor, back to the machinery of running a company that was in the middle of trying to be different from what it had been, which was the hardest possible kind of running. He looked at Emily one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "the company I'm running today is better than the one I was running 8 months ago." Emily looked up at him. "That's a beginning," she said. And she meant it without reservation, and without smallness, and without the careful professional modesty that she had worn for 3 years on the 3rd floor like a coat that didn't quite fit. A beginning was not nothing. A beginning built on the right foundation with the right people, paying attention in the right way. A beginning was exactly where everything that mattered had always started. Emily Carter had known that since she was 15 years old, sitting beside her father, learning to read the pattern in the noise. She had known it through 19 emails and 8 months of silence. She had known it in the 41 seconds that remained when the countdown stopped. She carried it forward now, not as a lesson she had survived, but as a truth. She intended to spend the rest of her career proving one signal, one person, one company at a time. The quiet ones were always watching. The only question that had ever mattered was whether anyone was ready to listen.